I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hi, people. This is Trish Wood, and you're listening to the Trish Wood is Critical podcast. It is a podcast that is designed to focus on critical thinking at a time when we are bombarded by nonsense and informational warfare. So that's what we do here. And I am sad today, and I'll tell you why. And it kind of is an informational warfare thing, too. At the end of last week's show, for those who stuck around to the end, I know some of you were mad that I interviewed Chris Hedges, which we can maybe talk about at another time. But I did a bit of a rant about the random murder and violence that is overtaking the city in which I live, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which used to be known as Toronto the Good. Like nothing bad ever happened here, really. And if a bad thing happened, it was a huge deal. So as I said at the end of last week's show, we have a real violence problem, random violence, stranger on stranger violence, not serial killers breaking into houses, but people on the street just going up to other people on the street and pushing them or stabbing them or literally lighting them on fire. I mean, this is what's been happening here. It's awful and it's unprecedented. And what I said last week is that, you know, for 2.5 years, we've been hearing of studies and experts around the world saying that lockdowns and school closures and the demonization of each other as disease vectors, the divisive language of our leaders and public health officials was creating an enormous, and in my view now, generational mental health crisis. So here's the rub about that. You can say that, you can throw statistics at it, but statistics don't tell the story because they don't tell you what it would actually look like. We know that there is a massive opioid fentanyl crisis in this country. People are dropping dead, especially in Vancouver. We know that kids are not doing well. We know there's an outbreak of depression. There are some suicides as well. But nobody really kind of puts names to it. If there's a suicide, people don't say, oh, they killed themselves because of public health measures or because of the lock. People don't say that technically. They might say because of the pandemic, which is a completely bullshit thing to say. It's not a pandemic problem. It's a policy problem, right? So that's what we talked about at the end of last week's show. And let me tell you that this week, someone I knew and liked very much, who I worked with at CBC Radio many, many years ago, a wonderful journalist and a really fun person to have a beer with, which I did many times, including, you know, going for wine at his house and eating wings and drinking beer on the Danforth. His name is Michael Finlay, was killed in a random attack on the Danforth in his neighborhood, my old neighborhood, walking down the street with a bag of groceries when a stranger caught on closed circuit TV, they're looking for him, pushed him over and did enough damage that he died within a couple of days. Terrible. 73 years old, retired, in reasonably good health. Random attack. So let me say this. I don't know anybody who died of COVID. I know people did die of COVID, but I don't know anybody who died of COVID. I do know of one suicide of a gentleman who went into a barn and put a gun to his head during lockdown. I now know of a second person who, in my view, was killed as a result of the mental health crisis that is now existing in many cities as a result of lockdown. I know 2 people who were clean and sober, who relapsed very, very badly because of lockdowns and isolation and 12-step meetings only on Zoom. One of them has come back. One of them is still out. When I say still out, that is the addict's term for still using, and he's using very scary stuff. So who knows what's going to happen there. He'd been on a ventilator 2 years ago when he first relapsed during COVID, and then came out, got clean, and then relapsed again. We are living in very, very scary times right now, and we have to start calling stuff what it is. The mayor of Toronto, who was all in on all of it, lockdown, school closures, vaccines, bribing kids with ice cream to get vaccines, even as the myocarditis research was coming. Kids who don't need it. They don't need to be vaccinated, unless maybe if they have a serious comorbidity. But children don't die of COVID. They're healthy. But he was luring them down to Nathan Phillips Square with a promise of ice cream if they got a vaccination. So he's all in on all of this stuff. And he is now calling for a national conference on mental health or something along those lines. A national summit on mental health issues. And he's doing what politicians always do, which is blame the federal and provincial governments, right? They don't fully and adequately fund mental health care, blah, 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 blah. And that is true. That is absolutely true. But until people start recognizing what's really at play here, it's not going to get better. We don't need more harm reduction for junkies and addicts. We need places where they can get sober. We need treatment beds, lots of them. That's what gets people off the streets. If you're just going to give them an easier way to get high, eventually they're going to overdose in one of the free accommodations. It's not what they need. Mental health, people struggling with paranoia or psychosis or whatever is going on right now. People jumping in front of the subways here, people swarming subway drivers here, people on the subway cars here behaving in such a way that people are afraid to run them. We've got to stop it. We have to stop it. And we won't be able to stop it as long as the various levels of government are throwing the blame back and forth instead of saying, gee, we did this. Maybe public health can weigh in on how to fix it, right? Maybe they didn't calculate the risk-benefit ratio. So maybe they can now come in and fix their mistake, because a very, very talented and important journalist, albeit retired, died, in my view, as a result of this. I'm just going to tell you one thing about Michael Finlay before I read the article about what happened to him. He worked in the old CBC radio building. I think it was on Jarvis Street. I worked there too. I believe it was Jarvis. And it was in an old girls' school, private school. And that's where Zosky was. I used to work for Zosky. I worked at As It Happens in that building as well. And Michael worked for Sunday Morning in a bunch of shows, but he did work for As It Happens and Barbara Frum. And in that area of the building, I believe it was downstairs, maybe in the basement, because there were no windows anywhere. And Barbara, who worked like a Trojan and was extremely talented, was working in a studio that was a kind of a dark, lightless, without window operation, right? So I didn't see this, but someone told me this story about him. On her birthday, everybody got together and got her these little kind of funny gag gifts and things. And Michael created for her a window out of cardboard that she could put up on the wall of the studio. What a wonderful gift for her. It was so thoughtful and very, very much like Michael, who was kind of a grouch in a very kind of Lou Grant sort of way. Excellent writer, great, great, great journo. Socially somewhat inept, but, sometimes the greats really are. And a hard drinker too, which is where we bonded back in the day, over our drinking. So that's Michael Finlay. I probably haven't done him justice, but I just want to read what happened and how it's being reported. A prominent retired broadcast journalist has died after Toronto assault that marks the latest random fatal attack in Canada's largest city. Michael Finlay, 73, died of his injuries 1 week after he was assaulted while out walking on Danforth Avenue in Toronto's East End. His former colleagues at the CBC say he was pushed from behind while grocery shopping on the afternoon of January 24th. I feel like he'd done the grocery shopping and he had bags. I think he was on his way home. Police have released images of an unidentified man who was captured on a surveillance camera while he was leaving the scene. The suspect encountered another man on Danforth Avenue, meaning Michael, and assaulted him. The man fell to the ground and sustained serious injuries, reads the initial police statement released on Saturday. We are aware the victim has since tragically passed away. Police are renewing their calls for the public to help identify the suspect, who is still at large. Now, I'm looking at a picture of the guy caught on camera. He's wearing a black jacket and those kind of Oakley sunglasses that the soldiers wore in Iraq, and a black beanie. Mr. Finlay retired from CBC in 2010 after 31 years at the national broadcaster. He worked for radio shows such as Dispatches, The World at 6, and Sunday Morning. Michael will be remembered as an exceptional storyteller, documentary maker, and editor, reads a statement emailed to the Globe and Mail by CBC spokesman Chuck Thompson. Reporters recall Mr. Finlay as being the quintessential tough but fair editor. I quite literally think of him every time I write a script, senior business reporter Peter Armstrong said in an interview. He knew everything. He knew the story you were working on way better than you can possibly know it. Mr. Armstrong said this editing process was often terrifying for reporters, but Mr. Finlay respected the work so much he would inevitably make you sound smarter than you actually were. That is true. Last week, Toronto Police Services announced that it will be stepping up patrols in and around the city's downtown transit hubs after a series of random attacks that turned deadly. There's a stabbing at High Park Station. 89-year-old woman was killed around noon while walking near King and Yonge Station, pushed to the ground by a 37-year-old man of no fixed address, now facing manslaughter. There have also been a series of non-fatal assaults over the past month, including that of a 23-year-old foreign student who was stabbed multiple times aboard the Spadina streetcar by an assailant she did not know. A 43-year-old woman has been charged with attempted murder. And on it goes. So that hits pretty close to home. And I've got to tell you something. It makes me really, really mad. It makes me really, really angry. I'm going to do my pitch now. But let me tell you who our guest is. It's so fun. We have all the way from the UK, from London calling. We have Toby Young. And he is a very, very interesting guy who started the Daily Skeptic, which is an anti-lockdown publication, but science-based, and also the Free Speech Union. So early on, he did this, I think, in 2020, maybe a little bit before, but in 2020. And he managed to coalesce around two huge issues and is doing very, very well. And I like and admire Toby very much. So why is he on? He's on because he found out recently that he was being surveilled by the federales, the British government, his posts. They were watching him like he was some kind of a terrorist or something. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So he's going to tell us all about that really important stuff. And then obviously, because it's me, I'm going to ask him if King Charles should invite Harry and Meghan to the coronation, whether you like it or not. I'm going to ask that question. So we'll be up with that interview in a second. It's really fun. He's terribly smart. Now my pitch. Our show, as you know, is funded by you all, and we appreciate the effort that our funders are giving us. Each small amount every month means something to us here, and you're helping us grow. And the more we grow, the more people will have access to critically thought through information. Everything we do here isn't news per se. We do some news. I do some reporting, original reporting here, but like my rant at the beginning of the show, that is opinion, but it's opinion based on fact. And it's opinion based on facts that people don't want to admit. So that is also important. You can agree with it if you like. The way a lot of people, as I said, agreed with me having Chris Hedges on because he's a socialist. But I think his war credentials and his stand on the Ukraine war and many other things make him worth listening to. So how can you help us out? You can go to my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. There's a support button there. You have a choice of PayPal or Patreon, and now Substack, which is our favorite because it's a free speech platform. So do please donate if you can afford it. We very rarely have been holding back shows. I think we've maybe done it twice because I felt that what we were doing at a time of so much censorship, I couldn't hold it back from people who needed the information. And so we're hoping to keep growing in that way, which is just kind of relying on your goodwill. So please do consider that. We'd be grateful. Okay, so here's my interview with Toby Young, who's written a great piece about his being watched by Big Brother for The Spectator magazine. And it's really fun. And here he is to talk all about it. Here's my interview with Toby. Hi, Toby. How are you?
I'm good, Trish. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. This is such a big story for me, watching what's happening with all of this censorship and government meddling around in the communications of people who are rightfully questioning public policy. It's an astonishing time we live in. You've written a brilliant piece for The Spectator called Big Brother is Watching Me, and I want to deep dive that with you. But before I do, just so people know, I want you to just explain what you do, who the Free Speech Union is, what the Skeptic Society is, so people get the gist of why they might have been looking at you.
Yes. Okay. So I've been a journalist for, I think, about 40 years now, Trish. And in 2020, I started two new things. The first one is the Free Speech Union, which is a membership organization that stands up for the speech rights of its members. And we now have about 11,000 members, 16 employees. We've fought hundreds of cases on behalf of our members. We've won some important legal victories. We've made some landmark amendments to government legislation. So that's been a huge success over the past 3 years. We're about to celebrate our third anniversary. In addition, I set up a website called Lockdown Skeptics in April 2020, just after the first lockdown had been imposed in the UK, and that's now turned into the Daily Skeptic. And it's it's a news publishing site. We publish 4 or 5, 6 pieces a day, sometimes by scientists, journalists, sometimes just summaries of pieces we think our readers will be interested in, and that's been a big success too. So it had in January 2.4 million page views in that month alone, and I guess I've been a fairly energetic critic of the UK government's pandemic response from as far back as March 2020, and that would be why the government asked, if they did ask, various agencies based in different government departments tasked with monitoring disinformation, with monitoring me and other journalists, as well as some scientists and some politicians.
Now, I just want to say one thing about what you just said for the audience, because there's quite a few Johnny-come-latelys on the COVID skeptics front, and we applaud them. But they're sticking their heads up now that it's going a little bit more mainstream. So what Toby did back in April of 2020 was hugely courageous, given that there was about 4 people in the whole world, him and Peter Hitchens and me and Alex Berenson and a very, very few others who were prepared to take on what seemed like incredibly incongruous public health policy that was very likely going to do more harm than good, and has. So Toby is one of the people who was there back in the early days, actually sticking his neck out and taking a lot of flack for it. And the free speech part of it was so prescient that you combined those two things sort of at the same time, because now it's all playing out that the reason they got away with some of the stuff they got away with, if I can put it that way, is because they were quashing free speech, weren't they? Or trying to.
Yes. We know from the Twitter files, I mean, we knew before that, but confirmation was provided by the Twitter files that various public health agencies, state agencies, board members of Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies were leaning on social media companies like Twitter, to suppress dissenting voices, dissenting about the wisdom of the lockdown policy and associated COVID restrictions, as well as the wisdom of rolling out the mRNA vaccines at warp speed. And I think that's the main form that censorship of dissenting voices has taken over the last 3 years, banning, shadow banning, suspending accounts on Twitter and Facebook. I'm currently still banned from Facebook, Trish. But I think that
Wow.
but in the UK, and I suspect elsewhere, our government certainly exercised influence over the legacy media by spending large amounts of money on advertising in mainstream publications, on mainstream radio shows, setting out the government's position, why you should wear face masks, why you should get vaccinated and so forth, and paying through the nose for these adverts in a way which made them very valuable customers to legacy media brands. And I think meant that the legacy media brands didn't want to publish too much dissent from the government's pandemic response. And over here, there was another arm to the government's kind of censorship machinery, which was at a very early stage, Ofcom, which is the state broadcasting regulator, issued a warning notice warning its licensees to be very careful about broadcasting dissenting voices who were critical of the public health COVID response.
See, what I don't understand about that is that just hearing those words even spoken to me as an old school journalist like you is terrifying. And what I ruminate on when I'm thinking about this is, do these people not kind of get what they've done here? Do they not see how dangerous and kind of slippery slopish this is? I mean, I feel like I'm living on another planet than the people who were kind of instituting these really kind of Soviet era policies around science and communication.
Yes. I mean, it is, as you say, from an old school journalist perspective, it seems very sinister. And that makes it all the more surprising that old school journalists on publications like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, aren't up in arms about this, seem almost completely indifferent to these stories each time they break. I mean, the story about these various shadow agencies working for the UK government, monitoring critics of the government's pandemic response, hasn't got much coverage in the UK media, just as the Twitter files didn't get much coverage in the US media. It is surprising. Yeah. I mean, I think what's happened, Trish, is that the government, the WHO, various national and international public health agencies, they persuaded themselves collectively that their response to the pandemic, which involved locking people in their homes, insisting they wear masks if they leave their homes, insisting they get vaccinated, in some cases on pain of losing their jobs and so forth, they persuaded themselves that this wasn't a contentious response, but was a common sense response that everybody could see as plain as day was exactly the right way to respond. And anyone dissenting, anyone challenging the wisdom of any dimension of that response wasn't challenging a government policy in the way that a journalist might have done in the past. They weren't saying, I think you, the Conservative government of the United Kingdom, have got this particular policy wrong. No, if you were challenging it, you were challenging something that was plainly in the public interest. It wasn't a partisan policy. It was a consensus, science-driven, evidence-based policy. So if you were questioning it, then you were trafficking in misinformation or disinformation, or you were a conspiracy theorist and therefore posed a danger to the public. What you were saying was potentially harmful. And that's how they justified to themselves, I think, these various senior politicians, senior officials, international bureaucrats. How they justified this suppression of dissent to themselves was, if we allow people to raise these doubts, to ask these questions about, say, the efficacy and safety of the mRNA vaccines, they will be endangering public health. Their dissent is potentially harmful. Therefore, in the interests of protecting the public, in this public health emergency, we're justified in extending our powers and using whatever means necessary to suppress these voices. And that's how people like me, Jay Bhattacharya, over here Carl Hennigan, Oxford Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine, were thought to be fair game and and saw themselves shadow banned, if not banned outright, on Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of it.
And smeared in the most grotesque ways, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you just said is so funny. Well, not funny, but it's actually sad, is that they're claiming consensus while suppressing voices that challenge the consensus. I mean, therefore, it isn't a consensus. If you have to keep people quiet, it's not a consensus, right? So it's really nuts. I don't want to talk too much about the politics over there, but it was a conservative government, right? It was Boris. And the kind of pro-censorship stuff, the big tech censoring people and shadow banning people, that seems to be coming from the left. So what I think really chilled me to the bone is the idea that in countries where there were conservative governments that you think might be somewhat more vocal and somewhat more interested in kind of preserving the idea of a free press and honesty in the way they report about science, seemed to be equally as captured. Do you know why that happened? Was it just fear that if they didn't do what public health insisted they do, they'd be, accused of killing Granny? I mean, was it that simple, or was there something more cynical going on?
I mean, that's the $6 million question. And I can only speculate, really, as to what the answer is. I mean, I spoke to someone who worked at 10 Downing Street when the decision was taken in March 2020 to lock down. And that was a U-turn. So initially, Boris held firm and said he didn't want a lockdown. And when asked, whether he was going to, because other countries were doing so in February and March 2020, was he going to follow the example of the Chinese authorities? He maintained that he was not. And that we should take it on the chin, much as we had done other other kind of respiratory viruses, like the Asian flu pandemic in the 1950s. And then he did a U-turn. So the question is, why did he do that U-turn? Was he lent on? Did Klaus Schwab place a call? Did the heads of Big Pharma say we're going to stop donating money to the Conservative Party? Who knows? But the explanation provided by this source inside Downing Street at the time to me was that they didn't know at that stage how dangerous COVID-19 was. They saw the pictures of hospitals being overwhelmed in various parts of Italy, people seemingly dying in hospital corridors. And I think the precautionary principle, as well as their own political interests, he said, dictated that they needed to impose a lockdown, because if they didn't, and if tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of people died as a consequence of their inaction, and the NHS was overwhelmed and people with COVID died in hospital corridors and people with other diseases weren't able to be treated, that would be a political albatross that could be hung around the necks of the Conservative Party and would mean devastation at the next general election. So he thought you didn't need to conjure up any conspiracy theories to explain why Boris had U-turned and the government eventually decided to lock down on March 23rd, 2020. It's entirely explainable for kind of rational political reasons. And I think that's fairly persuasive.
Yeah, I do too, actually. And it makes me mad because, I'm actually working on a project right now that we're really deep diving what was kind of known in March of 2020 and the time leading up to it. And the misrepresentation of the case fatality rate by the World Health Organization is it's astonishing. And it was bad science, and everybody, or most people, knew it, including Jay Bhattacharya and John Ioannidis. So if these people, and I mean the politicians and the public health people, had really wanted to play this based on science, they would not have done what they did. But it feels to me now in retrospect like it was driven by social media fear campaigns and legacy media fear campaigns. It's kind of like, oh, don't bog me down with the risk stratification. Let's not talk about that. Most people will be fine. We can't do that. And let's show them the terrible pictures from Italy, which is in retrospect explainable and was explainable then. So what they were doing was actually anti-science, because the science suggested that it wasn't as dangerous as they believed it to be when they reacted to it. And I think that is terrible.
Well, I think it wasn't straightforwardly anti-scientific. It was more in the realm of quasi-scientific speculation, i.e. modelling. A lot of the policy responses were informed by modelling. And what the modellers, what they told the UK government via SAGE, the scientific advisory body that advises the UK government. So it had a kind of modelling subcommittee, which included people like Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, but not just him. They were essentially saying, look, here's a reasonable worst case scenario. If you do nothing, hundreds of thousands of people will die of this virus. Now, we're not saying that is likely to happen. We're just saying it's possible in a reasonable worst case. So they didn't really attach a probability to it happening. And they certainly, I don't think, gave the impression, at least not when they were cross-examined, that there was a greater than 50% chance of hundreds of thousands of people dying if the government did nothing. They just said, here's a reasonable possibility. This is a risk you need to consider because it's reasonably possible that this may happen. And because governments are typically very risk-averse, they may think, well, in all likelihood, locking people down will cause more harm than not locking down, because it's not inevitable. It's not even likely that hundreds of thousands of people will die if we don't. But because that is a reasonable worst case, it is our responsibility to do what we can to mitigate it, just in case our inaction means it materializes. And it's the same kind of reasoning. I called it Pascal's wager. Pascal, the French philosopher, his argument for being a pious Christian was that, well, it may well be probable that God doesn't exist, but just in case he does exist, if you don't behave like a pious Christian, you'll go to hell and face eternal damnation in hot fire. But the cost of complying with the Ten Commandments isn't nearly as high as the price you'll pay if you don't comply, and it's true. So just in case it's true, the rational thing to do is to behave like a pious Christian as if it's true. And it's similar reasoning, and you see it with climate change too. I mean, I think if you talk to climate scientists who rely on similar models to sort of cast their gaze into the future, they're not saying that it's overwhelmingly likely or even probable that the world will catch fire in 50 years if we don't achieve net zero by 2050. They're just saying in a reasonable worst case, waters will rise, ice caps will melt, there'll be a plethora of extreme weather events. It'll be catastrophic. To avoid this calamity, to do what you can to mitigate against this catastrophe, the responsible thing to do is to curtail everyone's liberty now. It's the argument for curtailing liberty in the lockdown and now in the case of the so-called climate emergency, not because these terrible catastrophic things are likely to materialize if we don't curtail people's liberty, but because there's a reasonable possibility that they might. Therefore, if we're going to be cautious and risk averse and be responsible, we need to do what we can, do everything we can to mitigate the possibility of these terrible catastrophic scenarios materializing. And that was the kind of rationale, I think. And it's not exactly unscientific, but it's not exactly scientific either.
Well, and I'll say it's a bit cynical because the aftershocks of lockdown were not all going to present themselves immediately either, right? They kind of kicked them down the road because a lot of the aftershocks of lockdown are sort of deaths of despair and other things that are only really manifesting now, including where I live, by the way. And this may be a story for you guys, that Toronto, which is a very passive city of law-abiding people normally, but we had massively long lockdowns and massively long school closures too. There is a violence outbreak here right now that's like people are being lit on fire at the bus stop. People are being gouged in the eyes on the subway. Like women who work as bartenders are now carrying corkscrews in their purses to ride public transit. I mean, it's nuts. It's nuts. And it's absolutely a mental health crisis of some sort. These are not people killing people they know. They're random attacks on the sidewalk or in the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission. And my theory is that part of this is as a result of what we just went through. We dehumanized each other. People who were sort of sick mentally are now really sick mentally. And there's no explanation for it. So sorry, I kind of went off there. But the point I was making is that when they were deciding to lock down anyway, even though there might be problems, the problems wouldn't present themselves immediately. And now that they don't have to necessarily say they were caused by lockdowns either.
Yeah,
right?
they claim they were
caused by the pandemic.
By
right?
the pandemic.
Yeah.
But I think, Trish, even if, in the UK, no cost-benefit analysis was done before the lockdown was imposed. I don't suppose it was done anywhere.
No.
But I think that their reason for not bothering, apart from just, panicking and not having time, their kind of rational reason for not bothering is, well, it doesn't matter because we're not looking at what will probably happen if we lock down and what will probably happen if we don't. We're just trying to mitigate this catastrophic outcome, which admittedly there's only a limited chance it may materialize. So you could say, well, even if they knew at the time that locking down would have these appalling consequences across lots of different areas of our society, including the mental health of the general population, they could say, yeah, okay, of course those things are terrible, but this catastrophic scenario, which we're trying to reduce the risk of happening, that would be even worse. So we're still acting responsibly, even if by doing so, by locking down, we're knowingly causes all these terrible consequences. They're still not as terrible as this Armageddon-like scenario, which could, in some reasonable circumstances, materialize. We still have a responsibility. And it's the same argument, as I said before, could be made about climate change. In spite of the catastrophic consequences of the net zero policy, people dying of cold because they can no longer afford to heat their homes, they would say, yeah, terrible, but not as bad as what might happen if we don't do these things.
Yeah. I think modeling is the devil, actually. So just, I want to talk about what happened to you, but you mentioned climate change, and I've been following with some enthusiasm the story. Is it Oxford or Cambridge where they're blocking off the streets in that little experiment? Have you been following that little climate change experiment?
So there's it's a policy it's sometimes called 15-minute cities and sometimes referred to as 20-minute cities. And the idea is that you create zones within cities in which you can meet all your needs within a kind of 15-minute walking radius or 20-minute walking radius of your home. So, schools will be within that radius, banks, pharmacies, your workplace, etc. And it's all the kind of driving. The driver of this policy is reducing carbon emissions. If people don't have to travel very far to get to the workplace or to take their child to school, then you're going to reduce carbon emissions. And the way this is being rolled out in Oxford and Canterbury and in other cities, Edinburgh in the United Kingdom, is that local authorities, municipalities, are imposing traffic fines on people who travel beyond these invisible barriers within a 15-minute radius of their homes. So I think in Oxford, the policy, it hasn't been implemented yet, but the policy is that you'll be allowed to travel outside your 15-minute neighborhood 100 times a year. But if you exceed that number in your car, you can walk or go by bicycle. But if you exceed that number on a vehicle, in a motorized vehicle, an electric vehicle is probably okay. Then you'll be fined. And people are in uproar about it, and they're describing it as a climate lockdown. And I think people are exaggerating. People aren't going to be imprisoned within these 15-minute zones within Oxford. They'll just be fined if they travel in their petrol or diesel-driven car or on their motorcycle outside of these zones more than 100 times a year. And I think emergency vehicles will be exempt, and if you need to travel for commercial purposes for your business, then you'll be exempt. But it's still it is pretty draconian, and I think it's worthwhile getting worked up about, even without exaggerating exactly what's going on.
Well, it feels like a give them an inch kind of microcosm, right? And did you see the video of the people who implemented saying this is not a lockdown? Did you see that? It was like a hostage video or something. It was really, I thought, if these are the people running it, like, yeah, I'm nervous about I don't want them running my life that way. And the other thing I read in the Daily Mail about it, which was hilarious, was that people are fighting over the things they're putting down, whatever they're called. So people in cars are moving the barriers and getting in arguments with the people who...
Yes, yeah. There's something over here. They're called, I think, low traffic neighborhoods, LTNs, and councils put up these kind of, they look like kind of wooden flower pots. They look very innocent and attractive, urban landscaping. But what they are, they've got detectors in them. If you don't live in that neighborhood and you travel past, through this invisible barrier, you then get slapped with a kind of £90 fine, and councils are they're coining it from these clandestine traffic barriers, but residents are taking the law into their own hands and tearing up these flower pots and hurling the flowers down the street. Yeah.
This is why I love the UK, because I did see video too of some people pulling these the climate activists off the roadways, and some guy just got out of his car and dragged them, to the side of the road, which I thought was terrific. That's why I love the UK. You guys are really interesting people. So let's move on to what happened to you. I could talk to you about Britain all day because I've been thinking about it a lot lately, but let's talk about what happened to you that isn't so funny. How did you find out that, to use the words Big Brother was actually watching you? What's the story?
Well, funnily enough, I was contacted by a civil liberties campaign group called Big Brother Watch about 6 months ago. And they said they were compiling a report into various shadowy state agencies based in government departments like the Cabinet Office, but also a brigade of the British Army called the 77th Brigade, which is largely staffed by Army reservists, but which is tasked with, maintaining Britain's cybersecurity and countering, cyber warfare threats, including disinformation, which was during the pandemic on secondment, I think, to a department called DCMS, Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And Big Brother Watch was doing an investigation into whether or not these shadowy agencies based in or attached to various Whitehall departments were monitoring the activities of critics of the government's pandemic response, including me. And they asked me to submit some FOI requests, subject access requests, to these various departments to see if I was being monitored. And I didn't think, I thought, well, I'll play along. But I didn't think for a second that I was being monitored. But it turned out I was. And not just me, other journalists, Christopher Hitchens, Julia Hartley-Brewer, scientists like Carl Hennigan, Tom Jefferson, former head of the Supreme Court, Lord Sumption, even Conservative MPs like David Davis. Turns out that, and when I say monitoring, I mean, without wishing to exaggerate what was happening, they weren't monitoring our WhatsApp messages. They weren't monitoring our telephone calls. They weren't following us around. What they were doing was looking at our social media activity and our journalistic activity, the kinds of things we were saying on TV and the radio, and on websites like The Daily Skeptic. But it was mainly social media activity. So these various agencies would trawl through the social media accounts of people like me, trying to find instances of misinformation and disinformation, which they would then report back to their departmental overlords and say, X, has been tweeting about vaccine passports. We think that what he's been saying is a breach of the terms of service of Twitter. You might want to use your trusted flagger status to flag this up to Twitter with a view to getting him shadow banned or getting this particular post labeled false and misleading or having a health warning attached to it of some kind and so forth. Much like what we learned was going on with Twitter via the Twitter files. And it turns out this was happening, and it was happening at scale. And even though I don't think that any government departments actually contacted Twitter to ask Twitter to ban me. I think that's because I'm a relatively high-profile journalist and I set up the Free Speech Union. In one of my subject access requests to DCMS revealed that the counter-disinformation unit within DCMS had flagged up a tweet of mine. It was about a vaccine. It was about an anti-vaccine passport petition in France, which had gleaned 1.2 million signatures. So they'd flagged this up and said they thought it might be a breach of Twitter's terms of service. It could count as, pandemic-related misinformation, but they weren't recommending that DCMS use its trusted flagger status to alert Twitter to this because of, quote, free speech implications. Now, what they meant by that was, I think in my case, there could be blowback. But I imagine that people with lower profiles than me, just ordinary members of the public, tweeting about similar stuff, I imagine that DCMS did contact Twitter about them, and in some cases they did end up being shadow banned or banned outright.
And so what was that like for you to find out? I mean, they weren't, as you say, they weren't like tapping your phone or anything like that. But what was it like when you found out it was real, that they were actually focused on you?
Well, I think the most shocking thing is that in order to be persuaded that it was a legitimate use of their time and their resources, the personnel managing these agencies, some of whom have a background in the security services, in order to be persuaded to do that, to monitor people like me, they would have had to have been persuaded. They would have had to been convinced that my criticisms, Peter Hitchens's criticisms of the government's pandemic response, were in some way illegitimate. That allowing us to air these criticisms on social media platforms like Twitter posed a danger to the public, that it was potentially harmful. We weren't just, so it was outside the normal realms of, partisan political criticism. We weren't just to be considered critics of this government's policies. No, we were enemies of the state in some sense, and therefore fair game. And I think what's really alarming about this is that even though in this instance, these agencies and the government departments they were embedded in didn't cross too many lines. They only monitored stuff that was in the public domain. And as far as we know, in the case of journalists like me and Peter Hitchens, I think Peter Hitchens has more suspicions than me. They didn't actually ask Twitter or Facebook or YouTube to take our stuff down or to shadow ban us. But what would be to stop them doing that in future, and particularly under a left-wing government? One of the things that stayed the hand of, say, Michael Gove, who was the head of the Cabinet Office at the time, is that I know Michael Gove. I've known Michael Gove for 40 years. We're friends. So he may have thought, I can't do that to someone I've known for 40 years. But if it's a Labour government, and I have very few friends in the Labour Party, you know what, and they decide that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, you know, and that therefore they're justified in kind of using any means necessary to suppress misinformation, which is likely to endanger the public by discouraging them from using less carbon, switching to electric cars, moving away from gas, etc. They might well feel justified in going far further than they did during the pandemic. That's the really alarming thing. Once you've been branded an enemy of the state, you know, as someone who is a danger to the public, a potential adversary, then, you know, you are fair game. And the sorts of things that protect you from this kind of state intrusion in the normal course of events, they begin to fall away.
Well, and I think the proof of that is what's happened in America, right? They were much more aggressive about shadow banning and having people censored, and primarily under the Biden government, which is, in my view, right off the rails, even though I don't think it's going to last much longer. But yeah, I mean, it's really scary what happens when I do, you know, I'm an old lefty from way back in the day, you know, and now I fear them more than anything right now. I'm really quite disturbed about the aggressive way in which other opinions are not just not acceptable, but they seem to actually scare them in some sense. You know, I've seen physically people respond to rational things I've said as if I'm a lunatic or something. I mean, it's really disturbing. And I don't necessarily feel that way about their stuff in the same way, but they're just kind of collectively mad at the moment, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if we want to rein in this new form of censorship, which essentially involves branding dissent from prevailing orthodoxies as a form of misinformation or disinformation which poses a threat to the public. If we're going to try and stop states overreaching by weaponizing misinformation and disinformation in that way and persuading agencies tasked with protecting states from disinformation, from monitoring people like me, I think we need the left on board. We need them to make common cause with us. I mean, just because it's not them in the frame at the moment, for the most part, though, you know, some members of the left, I think, were also monitored. Some left-wing journalists were also monitored by these various agencies in the UK during the pandemic. Yeah. But for the most part, it was people on the right like me. But we need the left to make common cause with us, to realize that they could be next. Because without their support, without there being cross-party, you know, a cross-party campaign to stop governments doing this kind of thing, then it's just going to continue. And the reason there isn't a cross-party campaign, as you say, is because many people on the left are sympathetic to you know, these shadowy agencies being used to suppress dissent from these prevailing orthodoxies and policies during public emergencies like the one we've just had. I mean, surprisingly, you know, 25 years ago, they wouldn't have been. But somehow, you know, because now the people, you know, senior bureaucrats in many cases, senior politicians, the people involved in running agencies like the WHO are all left of center. They're all kind of part of the kind of liberal global elite. So they think of them as being, you know, on the same side as them. So they're not likely to make common cause with people who've been targeted in this very illiberal way by these various organs and agencies.
Yeah, and the people on the other side are just sort of greedy conservative monsters who only care about making money. I mean, that's how the anti-lockdown people were framed a lot in the media, right? It's just they don't want their businesses affected. They don't care about health. You know, it didn't seem to matter. I feel like this began, which is to say the media supporting this kind of lunacy, legacy media, around the Russia hoax, which now is being exposed yet again as the kind of nadir of all journalism, and it was, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And I think you can almost trace the kind of silo from the media who were obviously pushing fibs about Trump for all of his faults, and he had many. I always have to put that disclaimer, but he wasn't colluding with Russia, and they didn't install him as president. And the dossier was bullshit, and we know that. So I think there was a point somewhere in the trajectory of legacy media where they said, we're doing a bad thing for a good reason. He's a lunatic, whatever the narrative about Trump was. And so if we have to do this to get him out, we'll do it. And they did that for 4 years. So I don't think it was a huge stretch for them to become irrationally addicted to a lefty public health message that was also predicated on the same idea, which is maybe we're doing a bad thing for a good reason.
Yeah. And I think to put this in an even broader context, I think that it's an example of what the free speech campaigner Jacob Macham-Gama, who's just written a very good history of free speech, calls elite panic. And I think that in 2016, when Vote Leave won the EU referendum, the pro-Brexit side won in that referendum in the UK, and Trump was elected president. A lot of people,
they must have gone insane.
A lot of people, within the kind of global liberal elite thought something's gone terribly wrong here. All these people in America and the UK have voted the wrong way. Now, it can't possibly be because Hillary wasn't an attractive candidate, or the Remain side in the argument didn't put up a decent case. It can't possibly be because of a conflict of values. It must be because people who voted for Leave and people who voted for Trump were misinformed. They were given bad information, or they were deliberately misled by bad actors in the pay of Putin or communist China, or kind of dodgy businessmen and billionaires. This became this sort of suddenly they thought, the integrity of democracy is at risk, and we need to suppress all this misinformation and disinformation, which is making these election results turn out the wrong way. We need to suppress it in order to make sure people are properly informed when they come to cast their votes and vote the way we want them to vote. I mean, it was a kind of, I think, an elite panic in response to a couple of seismic, electoral victories won by, for want of a better term, our side, Trish. And they decided we have to do something about this. It cannot possibly be because, we fought better campaigns and our values are more closely allied with that of the general electorate, particularly, indigenous working class people. No, it must be because they've been manipulated in some way, because if they only knew the facts, they would have voted the way we want them to vote. And so there's this kind of, since then, there's been this kind of huge effort to suppress, to first of all, kind of make sure that the legacy media is completely on side and doesn't really give a platform to dissenters, people like us, but in addition to suppress dissent on social media as well. I think that's really what's behind it. And I think during the pandemic, there was this, they thought this is a classic example of what we know best. We know what's best for people. They should just do what we say. And anyone challenging that must be a bad actor, or they must be trafficking in misinformation or they must be conspiracy theorists. Let's exclude them. Let's cleanse the public square of their malign, polluting influence, and just make sure everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, because that's what's in the public's interest, and we know best.
No, that's a perfect explanation, and we certainly saw that up close here with the trucker movement, which was all working class, and I have a lot of faith in working class people. They seem to figure things out more quickly than those polluted with highfalutin degrees these days. And I think there was a huge panic around them too, because the people, the more lofty people, the elites, were very, very threatened by them. And the average Canadian, many millions of average Canadians, saw them as a good thing. But they were trashed in the news media and accused of being, what do you call them? White supremacists, I guess was the phrase they were using. All kinds of terrible things, none of it true. Because there was a threat there. There was a threat to the order of Justin Trudeau's response to the pandemic. And the people who live in Ottawa, where the truckers eventually ended up for a long period of time, mostly work for the federal government and buy into the pandemic policy. So they're still mad. They're still mad at the truckers, even though the hearings called out the nonsense that was being said about them.
Yeah. And the really sinister thing about Justin Trudeau's response to the Freedom Convoy wasn't just that he tried to, brand them white supremacists and demonize them. And it wasn't just that, their social media accounts were suspended. There was a serious effort made to withdraw financial services from them, to debank them. Which was it's an example of how the Chinese Communist Party tries to control its population, penalizing people who dissent from Communist Party dogma by withdrawing financial services from them. It's the social credit system. And we saw that being used in exactly the same way by a supposedly liberal Canadian Prime Minister. And the same thing happened to me, Trish, in the UK last September. So I woke up one morning to discover that my PayPal accounts had been closed. So my own personal account, the account of the Daily Skeptic, and the account of the Free Speech Union, all closed.
Wow.
Overnight, no real explanation offered, no right of appeal, I fought back pretty aggressively, not least because about 25% of the recurring donations to the Daily Skeptic were being made via PayPal, and about a third of our members at the Free Speech Union were paying their recurring membership dues via PayPal. So this posed an existential threat to my two organizations, and fought back pretty hard and got 42 peers and MPs to write a letter objecting to this to the then business secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg. He condemned what PayPal had done as a sinister new form of cancel culture, and faced with this pressure and a lot of people cancelling their accounts in solidarity, and me popping up on the TV every day to, condemn PayPal and ridicule their chief executive. They did a complete reverse ferret and they restored all my accounts and apologized. But that's not the end of the story as far as I'm concerned. Since then, the Free Speech Union has been lobbying the government to change the law so it becomes illegal for big payment processors and financial services companies to withdraw or withhold service from customers on purely political grounds. It's a form of censorship, and why should these Silicon Valley-based multi-billion-dollar corporations have the power to censor one side in important debates taking place in the public square overseas? It's ridiculous. It's a form of discrimination, I think, which is every bit as bad as discriminating against people on the grounds of religion or sexual orientation or color. So we're campaigning for a change to the law. We are making some headway, but I hope that the Conservative Party in Canada could take up this cause and pass a similar law in Canada. So Justin Trudeau cannot, a Canadian Prime Minister can't do again what Justin Trudeau for a while did to the truckers in the Freedom Convoy, which was, we don't want a Chinese-style social credit system to be rolled out across the West. And as we move towards becoming a cashless society with more and more governments rolling out, central bank digital currencies, the opportunities for governments to use these tools to suppress dissent are almost limitless. And unless we put laws in place to prevent that happening, it will happen.
Oh, Toby, people were so scared when they closed bank accounts of people who'd given money. I had people calling me in tears saying, am I going to lose my house? I sent the convoy $50. I mean, it was really a very, very serious psychological operation being, it wasn't just the money. It was what it said. Like, we can now see who gave money and we're going to go after it. And they did that. They closed bank accounts of people who give money to truckers. And the banks let them. Like, I want to say, hey, banks, this is not a good look, right? But the other thing that happened around that, just FYI, you probably know this, was that there was, in order to facilitate GoFundMe, doing some of this stuff, was a story by, I believe it was the CBC, my old broadcaster where I was for 20 years, did a story saying that the money in the GoFundMe was coming from, like sketchy, dodgy American, right, like the Proud Boys are funding the truckers, because they could not believe every time the truckers would sort of cash out their 5 million, 8 million, whatever, it would fill back up again because they meant so much to the people of this country and around the world. They were really huge in the hope department for people. So the way that they brought them down was to lie about who was giving money. And we just had the Emergencies Act hearings here, and that did not happen at all. It was another fake story. Talk about misinformation.
Yeah.
But it allowed Give, Send, Go, or GoFundMe, sorry, to shut them down on the basis of sketchy activity. They were picked up by, I think, a Christian funding site in the end, but I don't know where all the money went that they took away from them. It was just awful, awful, very hard to live through that, because when it first happened, I was so full of hope and loved seeing people on those overpasses in the middle of a snowy Canadian winter coming out to support them, and then to have it quashed by a duly elected government in a democracy in the way they did it is just it was traumatic for people. I will tell you that it was traumatic.
I can imagine. Yeah, no, it's awful, and I think we really do need to put legal protections in place, because the protections in our constitutions, the protections in the European Convention of Human Rights, were insufficient. They weren't what debanking people in that way wasn't unlawful in the UK. It isn't unlawful, so we need to change the law to make it illegal.
Yeah. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I got 2 topics I want to hit you on quickly. What is going on over there with the trans rights movement, and specifically Nicola Sturgeon? What is she doing?
Well,
what is she doing? It's insane. I just don't get it.
Yeah. So the Scottish government is very pro trans rights, and seemingly has been captured by trans rights activists. Now, that's not surprising, because the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon's party, and which runs Scotland, which has been campaigning for Scottish independence now for some time and almost won it in 2014. It's a kind of, their party is a sort of their ideology, their ruling ideology is a toxic combination of ethno-nationalism and left-wing identity politics. Now, you'd think those two things, wouldn't be particularly happy bedfellows, but seemingly they've been combined very effectively in this very toxic cocktail. What Nicola Sturgeon, she's done 2 things. So first of all, she's reformed the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, whereby it is now easier, or will be shortly, it will become easier for people who self-identify as the opposite sex to their birth sex to change their legal gender. So, as things stood, the way things are at the moment, you have to have lived as a different sex for at least 2 years. You have to have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. I mean, the bar is reasonably high before you can legally change your gender. What she's done is she's reformed those regulations to lower the bar. So you'll be able to, you don't need to live as a member of the opposite sex. You don't need a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. You only need to, it used to take 2 years. Under her proposals, it'll only take 3 months. And crucially, you used to have to be 18 to get one of these gender ID certificates, change your legal gender. She wants to lower that to 16. And there's gender critical feminists in Scotland and in the rest of the United Kingdom are concerned about this, because they're concerned that it'll be much harder to exclude trans women from women's spaces like changing rooms, from women's sports, to keep trans women out of women's prisons if they can easily change their legal gender. As if to illustrate that fact, in the past couple of weeks, it turned out that a convicted male rapist who now identifies as a woman has been housed in a woman's prison in Scotland. And that's been very embarrassing for Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, one of the kind of more emotive arguments that can be made against making it easier for trans people to self-ID is that you risk male sexual predators being housed in female prisons and assaulting female inmates. And Nicola Sturgeon and other trans rights activists have always dismissed that as a kind of ludicrously kind of hypothetical situation, almost never going to arise. And actually it has arisen, and it's arisen on the back of this change to the regulations that Nicola Sturgeon is in the course of making. So that's been very embarrassing for her. She's had to row back, promised to house this rapist in a male prison, and she's now talking about even potentially resigning. Now, the other thing Nicola Sturgeon's government is looking at doing, it hasn't committed itself to doing this yet, is a conversion therapy ban. In various, I don't know if this has happened in Canada yet, but it's happened.
It has happened in Canada.
Okay.
You can't, if a kid comes to a shrink and says, I think I might be not the gender I am, you are not allowed to investigate what the cause of that might be beyond them being trans. And if you do, you get your head chopped off. It's ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
So she wants to introduce a similar ban on conversion therapy, which would include gender identity, not just sexual orientation, in Scotland, and that's causing uproar as well. But she's not quite as far along with that as they are with reforming the Gender Recognition Act.
Why are women always on the bottom of the rung? We're always dog shit. It really bugs me because, we were, I guess I'd be a straight woman is what they call me, or a cis, which is a word I won't use. But, we marched with those guys back in the day when they didn't actually have rights, especially gay men, when they couldn't get married and all that sort of stuff. And now it's just, who cares what you think? You're a transphobe. I don't want to walk around a changing room at my gym and see a guy with junk. I don't. And frankly, if he wasn't being sort of an autogynephilic guy getting a thrill out of it, he would be covering his junk up when he changed, so I wouldn't be looking at it, right? Like, this is all the real Emperor's New Clothes discussion that we should be having that we cannot have. And I just feel like women are being thrown, under the bus yet again. Look at poor J.K. Rowling. I mean, she's so courageous. Yeah. It's just
the encouraging thing, Trish, is that over here, there has been an organized pushback. All these changes were happening, and they were embraced by all the main political parties until there was an organized campaign to resist some of these measures, organized for the most part by left-wing feminists. And the campaigns have been very effective, and they've certainly raised the salience of this issue. In the most recent British Social Attitude Survey, which is done every couple of years, which measures the public's attitude to things like gay rights and minority rights and so forth, the British public had become more liberal in the past couple of years, except on this issue. Where they've become more conservative. So the campaigning feminists,
they've done it to themselves.
And one of the reasons they've lost the argument is because they refuse to argue. They think it's beneath them to actually appear on a platform with like a trans rights activist will not appear on a platform with a gender critical feminist. They think they'll be contaminated if they stand next to them. They don't want to legitimize them by giving their toxic, bigoted views a platform. They just need to be pushed out and cast out. And that attitude, describing anyone who defends sex-based women's rights as a TERF, describing Britain as TERF Island, screaming bigot at them and so forth, that's not an effective way of waging, a campaign in the public square. And that's why they've lost the argument.
Well, and also, I think weren't there signs, and some of Sturgeon's staff were standing in front of these two trans people with signs saying decapitate Trish. I mean, it's violence. It's terrible. And I read enough stories about English police too, British police arresting women for dead naming somebody on Twitter. I mean, Jesus, Murphy, it's just like, it's ridiculous. It's like the world has gone mad, right? That when I see that happening, I really kind of, okay.
Yeah. The police getting involved and taking sides in what is, a completely unresolved live public debate is completely inappropriate. It's similar in nature to these various shadowy agencies based in Whitehall departments, monitoring critics of the government's pandemic response. The police have been persuaded that supporting the trans rights agenda is completely uncontentious, and the only people dissenting from it are bigots and homophobes and transphobes who have no place in British public life. It's a similar kind of reasoning. We need to persuade them that no, that this is a perfectly legitimate debate, and both sides deserve to be heard, and the police really shouldn't get involved.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, last question. You might not like it, but I'm here in the Commonwealth thinking about King Charles. And I'm just wondering, what is your viewpoint of whether or not Harry and Meghan should be invited to the coronation? Because that's all me and my girlfriends are talking about right now, really. So what do you think?
I don't think they should.
Yeah.
I don't see how Prince Charles. I don't see how King Charles, Prince William, Kate. I mean, how could they trust them? Not to take down and use anything they say against them, either in a future Netflix documentary or in a tell-all memoir. I mean, you can only betray people's confidence so many times without having to pay some kind of penalty. And the penalty here, I think, is that they don't get invited to something like this because they cannot be trusted not to, if someone makes a mistake, if someone speaks out of school, they're going to whip out their little notebooks. It's like, why would you invite members of the Stasi to your wedding?
And also, didn't they insult the British people? I mean, the coronation isn't...
People. They've described
right?
the royal family as a racist institution.
Yes.
Yes. He's tried to portray his brother as, a psychopath who attacks him all the time. I mean, why do they even want to go to this kind of this ghastly racist celebration of the British Empire? They can stay in Montecito as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, me too. I feel the same way. I guess, should I believe the Daily Mail stories where they say that Charles is considering having them there and that Welby is going to broker a deal, or is that just garbage to keep us involved in the drama?
I don't know what's going on there. I hope that Charles is trying to furnish himself with a reasonable excuse for not inviting them, rather than trying to find a way to invite them. Yeah. But who knows?
Okay, last word to you on the focus of the coronation. He said he was going to be celebrating refugees and LGBTQ. That's
yeah. That it's. I think Charles is making the mistake, which is he's making the same mistake that British Conservative governments always make, which is rather than try and appeal to their most fervent, passionate supporters, they try and reach out across the divide to try and appeal to their critics and not worry that in doing so they're going to completely alienate the people that have been supporting them, selflessly for decades. Why Charles, is wants the coronation to be a celebration of refugees, LGBTQ plus, NHS workers. It's like, people who read The Guardian hate the monarchy. Nothing you do will persuade them to support you. They'll just think you're weak and they'll move in for the kill. For God's sake, it's time to, throw a bone to your most loyal supporters, and not pander to your critics. But I fear that he's been poorly advised on that front.
I think he's getting bad advice. I think, in the wake of COVID-19 isolation, he would have been wise to do a celebration of small town pubs or something too, as the heart of a community. Like, there's lots of things he could have done that would really have been a celebration of English life pre-COVID too, about bringing people together. And he's not doing that. You're right. He's never going to convince I think this is about getting young people. I think that's what they're afraid of. Monarchy's afraid of, because the numbers are not in their favor with young people. And I think that's what he's trying to do. But, they're colonial. That's always going to be the spiel from the left and young people. So you're right. He should be just letting people hear the wonderful things about the British people and the country and the countryside and that sort of thing, like we saw at the Queen's funeral that I sobbed all the way through. I'm embarrassed to say, but I did.
No, I think it's unfortunately the institutions, the people that you'd hope would be celebrating Britain's history and culture are now ashamed of Britain's culture and history and just spend all their time denouncing it, apologizing for it. It's I'm afraid it's a symptom of decline. I hope we can reverse it, but it's not looking too optimistic.
No, it's not. And Simon Hepper, who I have a lot of time with, agrees with that. He says that it does seem to represent some decline. And the same here, too. I mean, we're not allowed to be proud of our history or our things. We're not allowed. I keep saying we're not allowed to have anything nice anymore, Yeah. Anyway, wow. So I guess you must be a really important guy if the spies are spying on you. So that's good, right?
Well, there is that. Yeah, I guess it's kind of flattering, I suppose. Yeah.
What did Dellingpole say? Is he on the list? He's probably jealous.
I don't know if he's on the list or not. I haven't teased him about not being spied upon yet, not being important enough to monitor. But I thought that would be too cruel, Trish.
It would be cruel. Anyway, have a good day, and thanks for doing this.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
So that was Toby Young, all the way from London. And he's written a great piece, as I said, for The Spectator called Big Brother is Watching Me. Also, if you want to know more about that story, my friend Paul Thacker, who writes on Substack, I think it's called the Disinformation Chronicles, also has an interview with the people who actually did the research that found out that people like Toby and Juliet Hartley Brewer and Peter Hitchens, too, were all being spied on. So you can find that on Substack of Paul Thacker, who's been on the show a couple times. Okay, so I just want to leave you with a little moment of hope, a little moment of zen, a headline that we've all been dreaming of for a very long time. Well, I think Joseph Freeman maybe got the ball rolling, the emergency doctor down in Louisiana who said, "Oh, I got it wrong. I'm sorry." And here's another person. This is a young, I believe he is a med student. And the headline is, "It's time for the scientific community to admit we were wrong about COVID and it cost lives." Wow. I just love that. I couldn't even believe it. And in Newsweek, too. Actually, Newsweek, although they can be bad, they have not been totally hideous on a lot of these issues. So that's good. So they did publish. This is Kevin Bass, who is an MS, MD, PhD student in medical school. And I'm just going to read you a little bit and then we'll say goodbye. "As a medical student and researcher, I staunchly supported the efforts of the public health authorities when it came to COVID-19. I believe that the authorities responded to the largest public health crisis of our lives with lockdowns, vaccines, and boosters. And I thought that was the correct approach. I was wrong. We in the scientific community were wrong, and it cost lives. I can see now that the scientific community, from the CDC to the WHO to the FDA and their representatives, repeatedly overstated the evidence and misled the public about its own views and policies, including on natural versus artificial immunity, school closures, disease transmission, aerosol spread, mask mandates, and vaccine effectiveness and safety, especially amongst the young. All of these were scientific mistakes at the time, not in hindsight. Amazingly, some of these obfuscations continue to the present day. But perhaps more important than any individual error was how inherently flawed the overall approach of the scientific community was and continues to be. It was flawed in a way that undermined its efficacy and resulted in thousands, if not millions, of preventable deaths. What we did not properly appreciate is that preferences determine how scientific expertise is used, and that our preferences might be, indeed our preferences were, very different from many of the people that we serve. We created policy based on our preferences, then justified it using data. And then we portrayed those opposing our efforts as misguided, ignorant, selfish, and evil. We made science a team sport, and in so doing, we made it no longer science. It became us versus them, and they responded the only way anyone might expect them to, by resisting. We excluded important parts of the population from policy development and castigated critics, which meant that we deployed a monolithic response across an exceptionally diverse nation, forged a society more fractured than ever, and exacerbated long-standing health and economic disparities. Our emotional response and ingrained partisanship prevented us from seeing the full impact of our actions on the people we are supposed to serve. We systematically minimized the downsides of the interventions we imposed without the input, consent, and recognition of those forced to live with them. In so doing, we violated the autonomy of those who would be most affected. Anyway, I have to tell you, this is an absolutely brilliant piece. I couldn't have written a better one myself. Most of us did not speak up in support of alternative views, and many of us tried to suppress them. When strong scientific voices like world-renowned Stanford professors John Ioannidis, Jay Bhattacharya, and Scott Atlas, or University of California, San Francisco professors Vinay Prasad and Monica Gandhi sounded the alarm on behalf of vulnerable communities, they faced severe censure by relentless mobs of critics and detractors in the scientific community, often not on the basis of fact, but solely on the basis of differences in scientific opinion. When former President Trump pointed out the downsides of intervention, he was dismissed publicly as a buffoon. And when Dr. Anthony Fauci opposed Trump and became the hero of the public health community, we gave him our support to do and say what he wanted, even when he was wrong. So this young man, I'm going to try and get him for the show. Don't you think I should? Thank you for saying all of this. Some people were awake, and those of you listening to this show know it because we've been having them on for 2.5 years, and we're grateful to all of them. But I also know that hearing people say these things helps us go on about our business because it makes us feel less alone and that things are changing, perhaps in the mainstream. And that's always a good thing. Anyway, as you go on about your lives in the next couple weeks, do notice all of these little brush fires, some of them huge dumpster fires that are burning. And all of these are things that are happening post-COVID. And you should start looking at these events through the lens of policy failure. Don't let them say the pandemic did it. The virus isn't killing all these people in Toronto. Public policy is. These are policy problems, and we must start speaking of them in that way and staying critical about them. See ya.